She was quiet, kind, and alone. But when they opened her old diary after her death, they discovered the heartbreaking truth she carried, a story that would change an entire town forever. It was a cold evening in the small town of Elmsworth, the kind of night where silence feels heavier than sound. The house of Auntie Mae sat at the end of Willow Lane, surrounded by memories and the scent of lavender she loved so much. For years, people had known her as the gentle widow who always offered warm tea and a kind smile, a woman whose eyes carried stories she never spoke. When she passed away, the neighborhood mourned quietly, flowers at her doorstep, candles flickering in her window. But none of them knew that inside that little house beneath her creaking bed, a locked wooden box waited, holding the truth Mae had hidden for over 40 years. Her niece Clara was the one who found it. She had come to pack Auntie Mae's things, expecting nothing more than old photographs, faded letters, and maybe a few heirlooms. But when she pulled the box out, dust rising like ghosts in the dim light, something felt different, heavier, almost sacred. The brass lock was rusted but still intact. Clara hesitated before opening it, her heartbeat syncing with the ticking clock on the wall. Inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, was a diary bound in cracked leather. The smell of time clung to it, and as she opened the first page, the inked words seemed to tremble. To the one I could never forget. The entries were written in a delicate, graceful hand, the kind of handwriting people once practiced with care. Each page told fragments of a story. A young woman's laughter, secret meetings by the lake, and a love that shouldn't have existed. The tone shifted as the pages went on. Joy turned to longing, longing to regret, and finally silence. Names were crossed out, days smudged by what might have been tears. Clara realized this wasn't just a diary. It was a confession, a memory buried in ink. Auntie Mae, the woman who had comforted so many, had carried her own heartbreak in silence. Outside, the wind began to howl as if the town itself remembered. The diary's last page was dated the night of a tragedy that had haunted Elmsworth for decades. The mysterious fire at Miller's barn, the night a young man named Thomas disappeared. And there, beneath the final line, Auntie Mae had written only one sentence. "Forgive me. It was never meant to end this way." Clara's hands trembled as she closed the diary, her reflection flickering in the window pane. For the first time, she wondered, had they ever truly known Auntie Mae, or had they only loved the part of her she allowed them to see? Long before the tragedy that would come to define her life, Auntie Mae was simply Mae Whitmore, a bright-eyed young woman with a soft voice and a dream of leaving Elmsworth behind. The town in those days was smaller, quieter. Its people lived by the rhythm of gossip and routine. Every morning, Mae would pass Miller's barn on her way to the bakery, the air heavy with the scent of hay and warm sunlight. That was where she first saw him, Thomas Miller, the farmer's son. He was unlike anyone she'd met, tall, with gentle eyes that seemed to notice the smallest things. While others spoke in predictable phrases, Thomas listened. And in his silence, Mae felt seen. Their conversations began with polite nods, then soft exchanges about weather, books, and dreams that reached beyond the horizon. It was innocent at first, the kind of connection that blooms quietly, unseen by the world. But in a town like Elmsworth, even silence had witnesses. Mae's marriage to Harold Whitmore had been arranged 2 years earlier, after her parents passed. Harold was older, respectable, and emotionally distant, a man of wealth and reputation but little warmth. He provided her a home filled with things but not love. To the townspeople, she was fortunate. To Mae, she was trapped in a life that did not feel like her own. Meeting Thomas was like breathing for the first time. He had a way of speaking about the world, about stars, freedom, and music, that made her believe there was more to life than duty. On evenings when the sun dipped below the wheat fields, they would meet by the lake behind Miller's barn, where the reflection of the moon hid their shadows. In his company, Mae rediscovered laughter, poetry, and the fragile pulse of hope. But beneath that beauty lingered the truth they both ignored. Love between a married woman and a farmer's son could destroy everything. The town began to whisper. A widow from the church saw Mae walking home too late one night. A shopkeeper noticed her buying wildflowers she never used to like. Rumors in Elmsworth spread like wildfire, quietly then suddenly everywhere. Harold grew suspicious, though Mae denied it all with trembling lips. Inside her diary she wrote of her fear and her longing. Every day I wake to the sound of his voice in my mind. Every night I pray for the strength to forget. But love is stubborn. And so one rainy afternoon she decided to run away, to meet Thomas and leave everything behind. They planned it in secret. She would come to Miller's barn at midnight, bringing nothing but her diary and her mother's locket. It was supposed to be a beginning, not an ending. That night, the storm came without warning. The wind tore through the valley as Mae slipped out of her house, heart pounding, the sound of thunder masking her footsteps. When she reached the barn, it was already ablaze. Flames licked the sky, devouring wood and memory alike. Through the smoke, she screamed his name, Thomas, but the fire answered back with a roar. No one ever saw him again. The town called it an accident, whispered of lightning or carelessness. Mae never spoke of that night, not even when people pitied her loneliness years later. She buried the diary along with the truth that she had loved him and that love had burned her world to ashes. From that night on, Auntie Mae became what the town remembered, quiet, kind, and untouchable. But in every flicker of firelight, she saw his face. And in every dream, she heard his voice whisper, "You promised you'd come." When morning came, Elmsworth was cloaked in a gray stillness. The air smelled of rain and ruin. Miller's barn, once the golden heart of the valley, stood in blackened remains, its wooden beams twisted like broken bones. People gathered quietly, faces pale in the smoke. Among them was Mae, her clothes soaked from the storm, her eyes hollow. No one asked why she was there before sunrise. They didn't need to. The sight of her trembling hands said enough. The sheriff called it a tragic accident, a lightning strike, they said, but Mae knew better. Deep down, she knew that love had lit that fire, and guilt would never let it die. Thomas's body was never found, only a silver chain near the ruins, the one she'd once seen hanging from his neck. That single piece of metal became the ghost that followed her for the rest of her life. The town needed someone to blame, and whispers found their way to Mae's door. Some said she had been at the barn that night. Others claimed Thomas set the fire himself. Harold Whitmore, humiliated and angry, filed for separation soon after, leaving her the old house on Willow Lane as if it were a punishment. She never protested. She simply folded her clothes, packed away her wedding ring, and moved into the house where she would spend the rest of her years in quiet exile. Neighbors tried to console her at first, but her silence unsettled them. Children would see her at the market, standing still as though listening to something only she could hear. Mae stopped attending church. She stopped visiting friends. Her world became a single house filled with fading photographs and the ticking of a clock that never seemed to move. At night, she wrote, pages upon pages of words no one would read. Her diary became her only witness, her only confessional. In those entries, she spoke to Thomas as if he were still alive, describing her days, her regrets, and the dreams that refused to let her go. "I see you in every flame," she wrote once. Maybe that's what love really is, something that keeps burning long after it should be gone. The years passed and people forgot. The young grew old, new families came, and the story of the fire turned into a local myth, one of those tales people tell to fill the silence at night. But Mae never forgot. Every time lightning cracked the sky, she would sit by her window and whisper his name, the same way she had that night. By the time she grew old, Auntie Mae had become a symbol of kindness, a gentle widow who fed stray cats and offered strangers tea. No one saw the sorrow that lived behind her calm eyes. No one knew that inside her home, beneath her bed, the diary still waited, filled with letters to a man the world believed dead. In those pages, she had buried her youth, her guilt, and the truth of what really happened the night the barn burned. Because there was one secret she never confessed to anyone, not even in her writings. The fire, she hinted once, was not an accident. It was meant to hide something far worse. But what that was, she never said. And so the mystery of Auntie Mae began, not with her life, but with the ashes she left behind. A few weeks after the fire, Mae began writing letters, not to anyone living, but to the one who no longer answered. Each night, she sat by the small wooden desk near her window, the candlelight trembling as though afraid of her truth. The first letter started simply, "My dearest Thomas, I don't know if you can hear me, but I must tell you what I never could." Her handwriting shook as she confessed the things she had kept buried, how she had planned to run away, how she had chosen love over duty, and how fear had betrayed them both. Every page carried the ache of a woman who had lost everything but her voice. When the ink dried, she folded the letters carefully and placed them in the diary, sealing them with a pressed white rose. In her heart, she believed that, if she kept writing, maybe the distance between them would feel smaller, even if he was gone. But not everyone wanted Mae to keep remembering. Harold returned one evening, his pride still wounded, his voice sharp with resentment. He accused her of disgrace, of shame, of tarnishing his name. Mae stood silent, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. She knew there was no point in explaining what love truly meant to a man who had never felt it. When he left, she collapsed beside the window, her tears mingling with the rain outside. That night, she wrote another letter. "Thomas, he will never understand. They never will. But I still hear your laughter when the rain falls." It was a quiet act of rebellion, to love someone so deeply that not even death or judgment could silence it. Her letters became her sanctuary, her way of surviving a world that refused to forgive her. Years later, Clara would find those same letters, their edges fragile, the ink faded like whispers. In them, she saw the transformation of a woman, from guilt to acceptance, from sorrow to forgiveness. One letter stood out more than the rest. Dated nearly 10 years after the fire, Mae had written, "I've learned that forgiveness doesn't erase what we did. It only lets us live with it." Beneath those words was a sketch of the lake where she and Thomas used to meet, drawn in pencil, gentle and incomplete. It was as though Mae wanted to hold on to a memory that no longer belonged to the world, only to her heart. Clara realized her aunt hadn't written these letters to confess. She wrote them to remember, to make sure that love, however forbidden, was not forgotten by time. Outside, the seasons changed, but Mae remained the same. A quiet widow tending to her garden, smiling to neighbors, her past locked away beneath her bed. What no one knew was that she had written one final letter sealed separately, hidden deep within the diary's binding. That letter was never addressed to Thomas, but to someone else entirely. The name was blurred by time, but one line was still legible. "I did what I had to that night. Please forgive me." The words hinted at something darker, something beyond love and loss. Was she confessing to the fire? To protecting someone? Or to a truth the town was never meant to hear? No one could say for sure. All they knew was that Auntie Mae's diary was not just a story of love. It was a story of what love can destroy when it is forced to live in the shadows. Clara hadn't meant to find it. She was only trying to preserve the fragile diary, to keep it from falling apart as she turned its delicate pages. But when the spine loosened and a slip of paper fell from inside the binding, the air in the room seemed to change. It was smaller than the other letters, folded into a neat square and sealed with wax that had long since cracked. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Auntie Mae's, but this time shakier, urgent, and without the softness of her usual words. There was no "Dear Thomas" at the top, only a single name, Evelyn. Clara froze. No one in the family had ever mentioned an Evelyn. For a moment, she considered leaving it unopened, but curiosity and something deeper, almost ancestral, urged her to unfold it. As she read the first line, the world seemed to tilt. "I never meant for him to die. I only wanted to save you." The letter was dated the night before the fire. May's words were desperate, almost frantic. She wrote about discovering that Thomas planned to leave town not just with her, but with Evelyn, the daughter of the local sheriff, a young woman barely 19. Evelyn, it seemed, was pregnant, and Thomas had promised to protect her. May had learned of it only hours before. The revelation shattered her, not with jealousy, but with guilt. She realized the love she had clung to was not as pure as she believed. She had been part of a lie larger than herself. But the letter revealed something even more haunting, that May had gone to the barn that night not to run away, but to stop Thomas from making what she called a mistake that would ruin 3 lives. She wrote that she brought a lantern, meaning only to talk, but the storm, the wind, and her shaking hands turned light into fire. "I tried to put it out," the letter said, "but it was too late. And when I saw the flames, I thought it was God answering for us all." Clara's breath caught as she read. The story she'd known all her life, the tragic romance, the mysterious fire, the grieving widow, began to twist into something far more complicated. Auntie Mae hadn't been the victim of fate. She had been its author. But even in her guilt, May had shown love's most painful form, the kind that destroys itself to protect another. The final lines of the letter read, "I told them it was lightning. I told them it was chance, but Evelyn knows. If she ever returns, tell her I kept my promise." The words left Clara trembling. She looked around the room, the old photos, the clock, the faint scent of lavender. Everything suddenly felt like part of a story she'd only half understood. Evelyn wasn't just another name. She was the missing piece of Auntie Mae's sorrow. Outside, the wind brushed against the window like a whisper. Clara folded the letter back into the diary, her hands shaking. She didn't know who Evelyn was, or whether she was still alive, but she knew the truth couldn't stay buried any longer. The diary wasn't just May's confession, it was a map to unfinished forgiveness. As she stared at the final words, one thought echoed in her mind. If Evelyn had survived, she was somewhere carrying the same ghost May had lived with. And for the first time in decades, the past began to stir again, a past that was about to walk back into Elmsworth and demand to be heard. It happened almost 30 years after the fire. Elmsworth had changed, new rows, new faces, and new stories that replaced the old ones. Yet, for those who remembered, the name Auntie Mae still carried a hush, as if speaking it too loudly might wake the past. Clara was closing up her aunt's house for the final time when a soft knock echoed at the door. On the porch stood a woman in her late 60s, dressed simply, with eyes that carried both sorrow and recognition. "You must be Clara," she said gently. "I was a friend of your aunt's. A long time ago." Her voice trembled on that last line. It took only a few moments, a tilt of her head, a familiar locket at her throat, for Clara to understand. "You're Evelyn," she whispered. And in that moment, decades folded like pages in a forgotten book. Evelyn stepped inside, her eyes scanning the familiar walls as though seeing ghosts in every corner. She walked slowly to the table where the diary lay, her hand hovering above it but not touching. "She kept it," Evelyn murmured. "After all these years." She sat down, her hands clasped tightly, and for a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Evelyn began to talk, about Thomas, about the night of the fire, and about the truth she had carried like a wound. She told Clara that Thomas never meant to run away with either of them. He had planned to leave Elmsworth alone, to escape the small-town judgment that had turned love into sin. May had gone there to stop him, and Evelyn had followed, terrified and desperate. "I saw her," Evelyn confessed. She was crying, holding the lantern. He tried to calm her, but the wind took everything. Her voice cracked. "It wasn't her fault, Clara. She never forgave herself for something she couldn't stop." The truth settled between them like dust, soft, heavy, and impossible to move. Clara opened the diary and showed Evelyn the letter that had been hidden in the binding. Evelyn's hands shook as she read the words May had written so many years ago. When she reached the end, tears filled her eyes. "She did it for me," she whispered. "To protect me, to protect my child." Clara's breath caught. You had a child? Evelyn nodded slowly. A daughter. I left Elmsworth after the fire. I raised her in another town, told her father died in an accident. She never knew the truth, that her father was Thomas Miller, and that May saved us both. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the house itself was listening. The diary that once carried secrets now held redemption. As dusk settled over Willow Lane, Evelyn placed her hand on the diary one last time. She wanted forgiveness, she said softly. I wish I'd come back sooner. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lavender, the same fragrance that had lingered in May's home for years. Clara watched Evelyn walk down the path, her figure fading into the same golden light that had once framed Auntie Mae in her youth. For the first time, Clara understood what her aunt had truly been, not a tragic figure, but a woman who had chosen silence over scandal, sacrifice over comfort. The diary was no longer just a record of pain. It was a monument to love's endurance. And somewhere in that fading light, it felt as though Auntie Mae was finally at peace, her voice no longer a whisper, but a sigh carried home by the wind. A month after Evelyn's visit, a letter arrived at Clara's doorstep, neat, cream-colored stationery with handwriting that felt strangely familiar. It was signed Margaret Hayes. Inside, the letter read, My mother spoke your name before she passed. She said you had something that belonged to me. Clara knew instantly who Margaret was, Evelyn's daughter, the last thread connecting all that pain and love from decades before. When she arrived in Elmsworth, Margaret carried herself with the same calm grace Auntie Mae once had, her eyes sharp with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. I never knew any of this, she said softly, as Clara handed her the diary. My mother told me my father died in a storm. She never said there was another woman, or that she loved him too. Her voice trembled. All my life I thought love was simple. Clara could only whisper, It never was. They spent hours reading through the diary together, the confessions, the letters, the guilt that stitched one woman's life to another's. For Margaret, every page felt like meeting the father she never knew and the aunt she'd never met but somehow recognized. May's words spoke of Thomas's gentleness, his laughter, his dreams of freedom, things Evelyn had never shared. She was protecting you, Clara said quietly, but Margaret wasn't angry. She only felt a strange kind of peace, as if she had been searching her whole life for something she didn't know she'd lost. They were all trying to save someone, she said. But no one saved themselves. Then, near the back of the diary, Margaret found something Clara hadn't noticed before, a folded note tucked beneath the final entry, written in faint blue ink. It was dated 3 days before Auntie Mae's death. The note was short, only a few sentences long, but its words carried a lifetime of weight. If this diary is ever found, know that I have forgiven myself at last. Love is never a sin. It is only what we do in its name that makes it sacred or tragic. Signed, simply. Margaret pressed the paper to her chest, tears sliding down her face. She forgave herself, she whispered. After all those years, the two women sat in silence, the ticking clock echoing through the house. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the porch, each one like a memory letting go. For the first time in generations, the story of Auntie Mae, Thomas, and Evelyn didn't feel like a curse. It felt like a lesson, a fragile truth that love, no matter how broken, still deserves to be remembered. As the evening sun poured through the window, Margaret closed the diary gently and handed it back to Clara. Keep it, she said. It belongs here, where it began. She walked to the door, pausing once to look back at the house. You know, she murmured, I think she stayed because she wanted someone to find her story. Maybe she knew it would heal someone one day. Clara nodded, watching as Margaret disappeared down the same road Evelyn had taken weeks before. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt heavy with secrets. It felt alive, as if Auntie Mae's voice lingered in the walls, whispering gratitude. And for the first time in nearly half a century, the past didn't ache. It breathed. It was forgiven. After Margaret left, Clara decided to stay a little longer at the house on Willow Lane. What was meant to be a short visit had become something else. A quiet communion between the living and the memories that still lingered there. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the window seemed to hum with the rhythm of Auntie Mae's story. Clara found herself reading the diary again, not out of curiosity this time, but reverence. She would sit by the same window where Mae once wrote her letters, tracing her aunt's handwriting like a prayer. At night, when the crickets sang and the air grew soft, she could almost hear a chair creak in the other room, as if someone had just sat down to write one last page. The loneliness that once haunted this house now felt like presence, not absence. Days passed quietly, and Clara began to notice small things. The scent of lavender stronger near the study, the faint sound of a music box playing in the hallway, though she'd never found one. It was as if the house itself remembered. She spent her mornings cleaning and restoring what time had taken, polishing the windows, repairing the old picture frames, folding the quilts Mae had sewn by hand. Beneath the wallpaper in the hallway, she discovered faded handwriting, words written directly on the wall, hidden beneath layers of paint. They read, "Love leaves marks the world cannot erase." Clara pressed her fingers over the words, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a haunting she felt. It was gratitude, a gentle reminder that some stories are meant to echo through generations. One evening, while clearing out the attic, Clara found a small box wrapped in a linen cloth. Inside was an old pocket watch, still ticking faintly, and a photograph, Thomas and Mae, standing beside Miller's barn, smiling in the sun. They looked free, happy, unaware of the storm that would later consume their lives. Clara held the picture close, realizing this was the last piece of their truth, the image of love before it became tragedy. She placed it on the mantel in the living room, beneath a vase of fresh lavender. It wasn't a shrine but a promise that their story would no longer be whispered about in guilt, but spoken of in compassion. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a monument to sorrow. It felt alive, breathing through the laughter and heartbreak it had once contained. That night, Clara sat on the porch, the diary resting on her lap, the sky above painted in silver moonlight. "You're free now, Auntie," she whispered. "Your story's been heard." A soft breeze moved through the trees, and for a moment, the scent of lavender filled the air once more. It felt like an answer, quiet, tender, final. The house on Willow Lane no longer kept secrets. It kept love. And as the night deepened, Clara understood that stories like Auntie Mae's never truly end. They simply find new hearts to live in. Somewhere, perhaps in another small town, another quiet soul would open a diary and hear her voice, gentle, forgiving, and eternal. Weeks passed, and Elmsworth began to whisper again, not with scandal, but with curiosity. The story of Auntie Mae, Evelyn, and Thomas slowly surfaced in town, passed from porch to porch, cafe to cafe, no longer wrapped in judgment, but in wonder. Clara had written an article, a quiet, respectful retelling of what she'd found in the diary. She titled it, "The Love That Stayed." It wasn't about guilt or betrayal. It was about forgiveness. When the piece was published in the local paper, something unexpected happened. People began leaving flowers on the porch of the old house on Willow Lane. Roses, daisies, and sprigs of lavender filled the steps where Mae once stood alone. It was as if the town itself was finally saying, "We're sorry." The change in Elmsworth was subtle but powerful. Old neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid Auntie Mae's gaze began to speak of her with admiration, of her kindness, her quiet resilience, her unwavering heart. She never spoke ill of anyone, Mrs. Doyle told Clara one morning, setting a small bouquet on the railing. Not even when she had every reason to. The town that once turned its back now turned its heart, realizing that Mae's story was not a cautionary tale, but a reflection of their own human flaws. Forgiveness became a kind of inheritance, one that Mae had unknowingly left behind for everyone who had judged her. And in that collective act of remembering, Elmsworth found its own redemption. One afternoon, Clara organized a small gathering in the town square, a reading of Auntie Mae's diary excerpts. People came quietly, carrying folding chairs and warm smiles. There was no music, no grand announcement, just the hum of wind through the trees. As Clara read Mae's final note, "Love is never a sin," she saw tears in faces that had once only known silence. In that moment, it felt as if Auntie Mae herself was there among them, not as a ghost, but as light. Every word spoken aloud was like breathing life into her again, giving her story a second chance to live, not in whispers, but in voices filled with compassion. The town that had once erased her had now made her eternal. That evening, Clara walked home beneath a sunset painted in amber and rose, her heart full. She paused at the gate of the house on Willow Lane, the flowers glowing softly in the fading light. "You did it, Auntie," she whispered. "They finally see you." The air was still, peaceful, the kind of stillness that feels like understanding. Inside, the diary rested on the windowsill, its pages fluttering gently in the breeze, as if turning themselves. Clara smiled through her tears. The echoes of forgiveness had done what time never could. They healed what was broken. And somewhere beyond that quiet night, Auntie Mae's voice lingered, warm, forgiving, infinite, reminding the world that love, no matter how flawed, always finds its way home. It was early morning when Clara decided to read Auntie Mae's diary one last time. The sun poured gently through the lace curtains, scattering gold across the warm wooden desk. As she turned the final pages, she noticed something strange. The back cover felt thicker than it should. Gently, she peeled away the lining, revealing a small folded paper hidden beneath the fabric. It was a letter, dated the same day Mae had written her final entry. The handwriting was trembling but elegant. "To whoever finds this," it began, "know that love saved me more than it ever broke me. I stayed not out of sorrow, but because this house held the sound of his laughter, and I couldn't bear to silence it." Clara's hands shook as she read. Mae hadn't lived her final years in regret. She had lived them in remembrance, keeping love alive in her own quiet way. The letter continued, "If Evelyn ever returns, tell her I never hated her. We were both caught in the same storm, and neither of us knew how to swim. Tell her I forgive her, and I hope she forgave me too." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. This wasn't just a confession. It was freedom. Every rumor, every whisper, every broken piece of Auntie Mae's story had led to this moment of peace. For decades, the town had painted her as a woman consumed by guilt, but here, in her own words, she revealed something else entirely: grace. Mae had chosen to live quietly, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood that love and pain often walk the same road, and she had made her peace walking it alone. Clara placed the letter back inside the diary, pressing the cover closed with care. She looked around the house. The soft light, the scent of lavender, the echoes of memories that now felt gentle instead of haunting. She realized this house wasn't a tomb of secrets, but a sanctuary of truth. Later that afternoon, she took the diary to the local museum, asking them to preserve it as part of Elmsworth's history. "It's not just her story," she told them. "It's all of ours." The curator agreed, promising it would be displayed not as a scandal, but as a testament to love's endurance. For the first time, Auntie Mae's words would belong to the world. Her voice finally heard, her heart finally understood. That night, as Clara prepared to leave the house for good, she stood at the doorway one last time. The air was cool, the stars scattered like memories across the sky. She whispered, "Rest now, Auntie. They know who you were." A soft breeze brushed past her, carrying the faint scent of lavender, gentle, forgiving, eternal. As Clara walked down the road, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The story was no longer trapped within those walls. It lived in every person who had heard it, in every act of kindness that followed. Auntie Mae's last page wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. And somewhere beyond the night, her voice lingered still, a quiet reminder that love, once set free, never truly fades.